Hi everyone, and welcome to Module 3. In this module, we'll have a look at how to teach the mechanics of grammar in your classroom. We'll discuss the focus on form approach advocated by the Quebec Education Program, also known as the QEP, or in French, the PFEQ. All right, we're going to start by doing a quick exercise that asks you to reflect on your own experiences teaching and learning language and how grammar is integrated into a second language classroom. Then we'll have a history lesson. Don't worry, I'll make it short and sweet. The idea is to help you understand where the grammar drill type teaching in classroom started and how focus on form builds on that history. Then we'll take a look at the PFEQ and how it suggests we teach grammar to students. We'll connect it to the writing process and see where fixing mistakes in writing can become an opportunity to target language structures. That is, to teach grammar, spelling, punctuation, etc., all in a meaningful way. All the way through, you'll be asked to do a few short exercises to help me see what you've done and what you've understood. Okay, let's get started. At this point, stop the video and take the online survey. There are no right or wrong answers. It's just to see what you bring to the experience of teaching and learning grammar before we start. All right, many teachers teach language through grammar exercises. Why do they do this? You might have already seen this or done it yourself, but many language teachers include specific moments in their lesson plan where they explicitly teach a grammar point. For example, a lesson plan might include teach simple past irregular verbs or review prepositions of place. Teaching grammar in this way is a deeply ingrained part of our language teaching culture. Let's see where this practice comes from and why it persists today. In order to explore why so many language teachers teach grammar through explanation and drills, we'll have to go back a few centuries and look at how the first language teachers approached teaching languages. I've taken all the ideas for this history lesson from the first chapter of Nasagi and Fotos's excellent book, Teaching Grammar in Second Language Classrooms. If you're interested in more about this topic, I encourage you to take it out and check out their ideas. If not, you can hang tight and watch the video because I've summarized it for you. Here we go. Our story starts in the late 1700s when all the best families had private tutors, homeschooling, to teach their offspring what was then considered the essential subjects, Greek, Latin, mathematics, and geography. The middle class soon begins sending their children to grammar schools. Believe it or not, that's what they were called, to get an education as well. Languages at this point in history were taught almost scientifically. We now call this the grammar translation method. It was assumed that all languages, including English, could be divided into parts of speech, that is, verbs, nouns, adjectives, and so on. Rules were taught explicitly, and students were expected to memorize them. The main part of a language lesson then consisted of translation from the target language, ancient Greek, for example, to English and back again. The vogue for studying ancient languages started to die down at the start of the 20th century, although the idea that studying ancient Greek or Latin was the hallmark of a high-class education persisted until the end of the century. Just ask your parents or grandparents. Then, World War II happened. All of a sudden, Governments recognized that having citizens who spoke the languages of their enemies gave them a huge tactical advantage. Intelligence services began not only actively recruiting polyglots, that is, people who speak more than one language, they also began studying how languages can be taught and learned more effectively. Not surprisingly, they quickly realized that memorizing rules and translating texts didn't work very well if you wanted to function with any fluency in a modern language. At this time, modern psychology was really coming into its own. Psychologists like Freud, Skinner, Piaget, and Pavlov were publishing and influencing popular culture and education. The audiolingual and direct methods, which were some of the most popular methods of learning language at the time, were directly influenced by theories like Pavlov's ideas of conditioning. Remember, that was the one where the dog heard the bell and associated it with time for food. My cat still does this. Let's take a closer look at audiolingual and direct methods in the next slide. All right, in these methods, learning was thought of as a kind of habit formation, just like the dogs with the bells. If you said the same things over and over, you'd eventually be able to say them without thinking, kind of like when you first learn how to say je m'appelle, je m'appelle, je m'appelle, until it becomes automatic. Curriculum designers in these methods taught language focusing on grammatical structures in what they considered a measured and lockstep manner. In other words, from simple forms to more complex forms. At each stage, hearing and repeating phrases over and over again until they were acquired. These methods had some success and are still used in language learning apps that you may know, where you listen and repeat phrases. So what was the problem with Audiolingual? Why don't we continue to use it? Well, as you might have guessed, the problem was the approach didn't really work when students were placed in situations where the stock phrases they'd memorized couldn't be used. Spontaneous conversations that required agility with language were difficult. The main issue was that in these approaches, the focus was still on learning grammar structures, not on the development of real-life skills. Other approaches based on different psychological theories were also emerging at this time, including the reading approach, the oral and situational method, the silent way, and total physical response. Each of them had different theories about how humans learn language, and each of them worked to different degrees for different teachers and different language learners. All, however, continued to base their approach in grammar, that is, the structure and form of the language. All included an analysis of things like verb tenses. None of them focused primarily on real-life communication. The most popular form to emerge in the 20th century, and one that's still widely used today, is the PPP structure. This is a teaching approach that uses a three-stage sequence to teach grammar. First stage is the presentation stage. Second is practice. And the third is the production. You may have been taught this way or even teach this way to your students. In the presentation stage, a new grammar rule or structure is introduced, generally through a text, a dialogue, or a story. In the practice stage, students are given various kinds of exercises to repeat, manipulate, or reproduce the targeted form. Finally, in the production stage, learners are encouraged to use the rules freely and in more communicative activities. The overall aim of the PPP approach is automatic and spontaneous use of language. So here's the issue. How well does the PPP reach its goal? Does teaching grammar explicitly in these three stages generally result in learning a language rule spontaneously in most learners? I don't know about you, but when I first started teaching English in high school, I used to pull my hair out with frustration when I spent hours planning a lesson on a form. For example, prepositions, and then giving students exercises to practice the form, and then finally giving them a quiz, where most of them did reasonably well. But then the next day, when I asked them to use the form in writing, it didn't work. They kept making mistakes. Why? Why didn't it work? I'd taught them, they'd done the exercises, they'd passed their quiz, so why couldn't they use this form again? Think about your own teaching practice and the way you were taught. Did it work well for you? The problem with the PPP approach, and many of the other approaches preceding it, is that it assumes people can learn to communicate accurately and spontaneously by learning grammar rules. If we stop to think about this a second, we'll see this doesn't make a lot of sense. Most of us learned to speak spontaneously, reasonably accurately in our first languages before we were even old enough to go to school. We continued to speak our languages with enough accuracy to communicate clearly with the people around us, even before we had our first grammar lesson. Therefore, if the goal of a language education program is to have students produce spontaneous and accurate language, then teaching grammar rules on their own, like we do in PPP, just isn't enough. 30 plus years of research into this idea backs this experience up. Now we arrive at the 21st century, where the focus is on communicative approaches. And the aim of language learning is to acquire a communicative ability, not simply learning grammar rules and structures. So, do we just drop grammar teaching altogether then? In some cases, they tried that. The whole language approach was very popular at the end of the 20th century, and many English schools, that is, English first language schools, never teach grammar explicitly to their students. Does it work when you're teaching a second language? Well, no. They tried that with French immersion programs. Even when language learners are exposed to large amounts of the target language, like they are in French immersion classes across Canada, it's still not enough to allow them to fully acquire many aspects of the target language. In other words, we have to find some way to teach language communicatively that still includes explicit grammar teaching in a meaningful way. So, what are we supposed to do? Well, in the early part of the 21st century, researchers in second language education started to agree that an approach was needed that focused on language structures within a communicative approach. In other words, we need to strike a balance between teaching grammar explicitly without a communicative context and teaching communication skills without discussing grammar. The most popular model that managed to do this was called Focus on Form. Focus on Form was also the approach adopted by the Ministry of Education in Quebec in the educational reform. It's an integral part of Competency 3, writes and produces text. In the next slide, we'll take a closer look at what's actually written about focus on form in the Programme de Formation d'Éducation du Québec. Take a moment now to read this excerpt from the Programme de Formation d'Éducation du Québec, also known as the PFEQ. This excerpt is taken from the program for ESL Secondary Cycle 2, but it can be found more or less verbatim in all the programs published by the Ministry for English and English Second Language. Take a few minutes now. You may want to pause the video here to answer these check-in questions. What does focus on form include in this document? How does it explain the way students develop their knowledge of language according to what's written here? How is focus on form done in a communicative teaching and learning environment? In other words, what does the teacher do? What do students become aware of? Hopefully, you were able to figure out that a focus on form approach is different from the PPP approach in a few key ways. First, teachers don't decide to teach a grammar point. For example, today I'm going to teach simple past verbs, and then students learn it. In fact, it's the other way around. The teacher has students communicate, orally or in written form, in the target language, and then the teacher notices mistakes the students are making. Once the teacher notices the mistakes, they decide to select one or two mistakes to correct. That's what the PFEQ means by corrective feedback. It's also why this approach is more learner-centered than previous approaches, and why it's adapted to the learner's progression and not determined by the teacher. One helpful way to think of it might be as a problem-solving approach, where the student tries to communicate, the student makes a mistake, the teacher helps the student see the mistake, the teacher helps the student learn the correct form, the student practices the correct form, and then the student focuses on using the correct form in future speech or writing. Okay, so if the focus on form is a kind of problem solving, how do we do this realistically in an ESL class of 30 plus students who are all at different levels? Don't panic just yet. Take a look and see how this can be done. First of all, let's think of language like a bicycle. Communication happens when the bicycle runs smoothly. I like this analogy because it helps us to see that grammar is an important part of communicating, but it's still only part of a whole. Let's think of grammar as the gears in a bicycle. If the bicycle is the language you use to communicate a message that's easily understood, then the grammar are the gears, vocabulary are the wheel, intonation is the bell. You get the picture. So we're going to take our bicycle on a short trip. We'll ask our students to write us a short text, and then we'll be able to see how well their bicycles are running. Here is a roadmap for our trip. Can you see the student trying out the bicycle? This is them writing the text. Oh wait, did I forget to mention that our trip happens during the writing process? Here's the writing process, remember? Where do you think grammar teaching will happen? What stage? To get you started, let's take a closer look at the writing process. What's step one? If you guessed write a text, you're right. You can consider this part of the process the diagnostic. This is where you check to see what mistakes the students are making. Using our analogy of the bicycle, as the students ride their bike, in other words, write their text, it's up to you to judge. How well are students communicating when they produce the language, oral or written? Are they reaching their destination? Do others understand what they are saying? Do others understand the text that the students are writing when they read it? How could the communication be improved? As a teacher, you're going to start by identifying the problems. Here's an example of a short text that a grade 6 student wrote. Okay, full disclosure, I asked my son, who speaks English well, but who goes to school in French, to write a short text for me. As you can see, one of my former students has identified some of his mistakes. In this case, they're mostly spelling, which makes sense because he's a bilingual kid, and he already has an innate understanding of the most common grammatical structures in English already. You can do diagnostic tests like this one if you're working one-to-one, or you can ask the whole class to write short text to get a sense of where most students are making mistakes. The key is to get students writing short text like this as frequently as possible. Don't worry, you don't have to correct and grade everything. We'll take a look how to grade strategically when we talk about portfolios later on. By the way, free writing makes a great exercise for diagnostic. Just a reminder, free writing happens when you ask students to write as much as they can on a given topic without stopping in English for 5, 10, 15 minutes. This way you can see what mistakes they're making most commonly and where you need to focus your instruction for the class. Okay, now that we've seen the bicycle running and we've done a diagnostic to see where the wheels are wobbly or where the brakes are squishy, in other words, where are the mistakes that could be corrected to help the student communicate more clearly? Take each diagnostic text and note a few things the students could work on to improve. If you're doing this for a class, you can then make a list of the top 10 mistakes they're making. At this point, you can now select which areas to focus on in your instruction in your next lesson. You can even use actual examples of the mistakes they've made, obviously without naming the students' names, which will make the reason for learning the grammar point more apparent for the students. They might even stop saying, "Why are we doing this?" to your face or silently in their heads. It should be obvious to them why they're doing it. It's linked to some mistakes they're making when they write. Okay, let's have a look at another text written by a grade 6 ESL student. What are the errors? Which ones should you fix? Should you fix all of them? In what order? Which ones do you prioritize? Take a minute. You might need to pause the video to identify some mistakes. When you're ready, we'll go to the next slide to see which mistakes you should address first. Sometimes there are so many mistakes in a text you don't know where to start. Here is a key point I want you to try and remember. Don't try to teach everything all at once. Have you ever had a paper given back to you that was covered in red ink? It's discouraging and confusing. If you try to fix too many things at once, you'll end up overwhelming and confusing your students. The key is to focus on getting one thing right at a time. If you pick one mistake and really teach that, and then go on to the next one once it's acquired, it'll be a lot easier for your students and they'll feel less overwhelmed. Once the students have fixed the problem area and have practiced and got it right, you can move on to the next problem. All right, so which areas should you focus on? I've created a little mechanics toolbox, in other words, a checklist, based on research done by Danielle Gannett. Danielle, who's a former prof at UCAM, did some really interesting work into error correction and feedback. Here in a nutshell is what she had to say about where to focus your attention. In other words, what errors to tackle first. The first error that Danielle's research says you should look at is errors that lead to a communication breakdown. This makes sense. If it's hard to tell what the student is trying to say, then there's a serious issue. Since the whole point of language learning in the communicative approach is to communicate clearly and effectively, we need to address these errors first. Take a look at the ice cream text again. You may want to pause and rewind. Did you see any mistakes that impede understanding? Remember, we are teaching students to write text that can be understood by someone who only understands English. So picture Brandon from Mississauga, Ontario. Are there any mistakes that might make it difficult for him to understand a part of the text? The next errors to focus on are when a student uses language that is stigmatized, for example, swearing. Can't tell you the number of times I've had to explain to my high school students why using the F word in class in front of their teacher is inappropriate. The third area to focus on are errors that have been the focus of instruction. If the students are making the same mistakes even after you've taught them, then the lesson obviously didn't sink in. Get the students to notice the mistake. Again, explain why it's a mistake and correct it. Then, focus on errors that have been selected by the teacher or learner himself. If you start using a portfolio approach, you can ask the students to pick one of their mistakes that they want to focus on. Giving students ownership over their learning is powerful and make them more invested. If they make mistakes with a form they've selected themselves, then you need to go back and scaffold their understanding or draw their attention to what might be a careless mistake. Finally, focus on errors that occur frequently. If you're doing a diagnostic and the student is doing a mistake over and over again, by concentrating your attention on these mistakes, you can maximize your teaching. Take a look at the text again. Choose which mistake you'd focus on and why. Post your answer to the discussion board. I've provided an example of how to do this in the next slide. The error I chose to focus on was when the learner wrote, "My favorite flavors ice cream are." I'm going to imagine that in my class, we've been working on collocations. These are groups of words that go together in English. And that we've been practicing the expression flavors of ice cream in preparation for this writing exercise. So my reason for choosing this mistake is that it's been the focus of instruction. In case you need a reminder, here is how we can use the activate, build, and check phases of teaching to teach focus on form. In the activate phase, we draw students' attention to the structure by looking at correct and incorrect examples and helping them with inductive reasoning. At this point, it's great to answer why it's important to learn the structure. We show them their mistakes. Then we move on to the build phase, where we model how to use the structure, compare correct and incorrect structures, and practice with controlled exercises like fill in the blank and less controlled like guided writing. Finally, we check. We ask the students to explain the rule to a friend, for example, and we have them write more practice sentences that only focus on the targeted structure, or even a new text. It's creative writing. Here's an example lesson using the error flavors of. In the first phase, I would activate or draw attention to the mistake. For example, I might be at the board and ask the students to read the sentence again while I say the correct version out loud. Flavors of ice cream. I would draw their attention to the missing word and have the students write the correct version on the board or in their books. Then I would move to build with them. We'd build their understanding by asking the students what other foods have flavors. I might provide an example like gum, get them started, and model when to use flavors of and just flavors. For example, there are many flavors of gum. My favorite flavor is mint. I could teach the rule through induction. Or in other words, we could figure out that when it's a flavor in the food, we need to say flavor of food. But when it's the flavor followed by the copula is or are, then there's no of. It's just flavor is. Finally, I would check my students' understanding and make sure that they really got it. I would have the students practice with a few more short examples, like my brother's favorite flavor of gum is. I could have the students correct the mistake in the original text. And then I would ask the students to write a few sentences on their own using the targeted expression flavors of and simply flavor is or are. After you've gone through these phases of the lesson and the student hopefully understands what the mistake was and how to write it correctly next time, you need to design an activity that asks the students to use the structure more spontaneously. In other words, take another bike trip. This is an example of a writing sheet that I used with my students. Every time they wrote something, I asked them to include what form they were focusing on. For some students, this might have been capitals, for example. For others, it was spelling. And they kept track of all the words they'd previously misspelled in their personal vocabulary notebook. In one case, I had a student who was really advanced, the haiku champion of Canada at age 12. He and I agreed that he would work on including things like poetic devices in his creative writing or including pathos, which is appealing to the emotions in his argumentative text. The point is, everyone can become a better writer. Everyone can find something to work on each time they write. When it came to evaluating their work, I didn't give a grade for all their language forms. I only looked at the ones that they were meant to be focusing on. That's why it was important that they wrote it at the top of their sheet. I still gave them feedback on things to focus on for next time, often in the form of a bullet pointed list, and they chose from this list something to focus on the next time they wrote. But maybe I digress. Let's go back to looking at some examples of activities you can use to get students to reinvest their understanding of the form that you've been focusing on. The next slide will show you some example writing activities to practice language structures. These ones are designed mostly for lower level ESL students, but some of your enriched students might be having troubles with these too. The idea is that you have a look and see if the students are having a problem with a form, what kind of topic would get them to really practice it for the next time they write? For example, if you're working on capital letters, you might ask students to describe meeting a celebrity in a restaurant. The student would have to capitalize the name of the restaurant, the day of the week, the month that they were there, the names and positions of the people they met in the restaurant, etc. Take a moment to look at all the examples and think of others if you can. Okay, now that you've had your students write a text, you've done a diagnostic, you've taught specifically to one error, they've practiced it, and they've rewritten a new text using the same targeted structure, you get to start the process all over again. It's cyclical. Write a new text, check and see, did they manage the form? If so, great. Do a new diagnostic, focus a new form. If not, go back, focus on that form again. Understand that each time you write with students, they will make mistakes. Sometimes the mistakes are the same ones. But each time you do a diagnostic, teach the form, and write again, they should improve, even if it's incrementally. When I started using focus on form with the portfolio-based approach in my classroom, it was the first time I really truly started to see my students' writing improve, and the first time I stopped pulling my hair out so much. In a great way, the students also got to see that they were improving, and they stopped complaining about my grammar lessons so much and started paying attention. Hopefully, this video has convinced you to look at focus on form and teach it in a way that's more learner guided, because that completes Module 3. Before you finish, make sure you've done the following. Taken the online survey at the start. Completed the history quiz. Answered and posted a mistake you fix in ice cream and given a reason why you chose that mistake to fix. Thanks everybody. Thanks for your patience with my timing and the mistakes I'm making as I'm reading. I hope you're all well, and if you have any questions about this, please feel free to email me and I will be very happy to get back to you. All right.